It's so easy sometimes to look at immigration as a legal issue, as an economic issue, as a foreign policy issue, as a political issue. But the human issue specifically of a woman's body and how it's abused on the border is, I think, one of those stories, one of those themes that I think is so often ignored.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Elaine Howard Eklund. I'm a sociologist and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Today, we're bringing you a conversation that I had with a guest this summer, which seems like a millennia ago now. Despite all we've lived through these past months, we still believe this interview is worth listening to. I'll set the context. The interview was recorded amidst the George Floyd protests and uprising for Black lives. It was also in the context of the Trump presidency, the detention of children, and the crisis at the border. All of this still remains important to attend to, especially as we continue to transition administrations and work to heal the very real divisions in our nation. Let's listen in. Today, I'm going to be talking about religion, gender, and immigration with my guest, Miguel De La Torre, who is a professor at the Iliff School of Theology. He's also a scholar, an activist, an author, and an ordained minister in the Southern Baptist Convention. Miguel, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
In this moment, in this time, with so much that's going on around us, if you look at the world through the lens of the work that you've committed yourself to, tell us a little bit about what's rising to the surface for you right now.
Well, you're absolutely right. These are indeed trying times in a multiple of reasons. I guess what's foremost in my mind right now, as I'm seeing the protests, as I'm seeing the rebellion literally in the streets, is how easily the lives of brown people could sometimes be forgotten, specifically the fact that we are in a nation that cages brown children on our borders. And don't get me wrong, by all means, the focus needs to be on Black lives mattering, because for so long in this country, they have not. But what I hope we do not forget is that the same structures that devalues the lives of African Americans are also the same structures that devalues the lives of all people of color. So that the reason we can have brown children in cages in this country is because Black lives have never mattered. And the only thing that really encourages me at this point is that what I am seeing is new alliances being formed right now, not just between Black and brown communities, but other communities of color as well. Because together, I think we could have a much stronger voice in changing the systemic racism which has been for so long part of this country.
That's well put. As you know, the name of our podcast is Religion Unmuted. And for so long, another voice that's been missing, or voices, I should say, are women's voices, particularly women of color. What are you seeing right now, and what's the need that could be filled by women's voices in this moment?
It seems to me that white women should follow the lead of women of color at a moment like this. And by all means, there's been many white women who have been allies, but we also have to recognize that in many cases, white women have been part of the problem of white supremacy, if not the advocates of white supremacy. So when I say that this is a moment for white women to follow the lead of women of color, I think it's because of that double consciousness that Du Bois talks about, that women of color might have a better grasp of how white supremacy works within both genders in the white community.
You know, we're talking about unmuting women's voices, so I want to ask you, what can men do to become part of unmuting women's voices?
Well, number one, I would say know when to speak. And that is, obviously, as I mentioned before, I can never speak about what it means to be a woman or a woman of color in this country because I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. What I can do, though, is in those spaces where women are not present and where only the voices of men are being heard, how do I bring those voices into the conversation? How do I not remain silent when sexist comments are obviously being made? How do I not remain within my male privilege at moments when you need people to speak against what's going on? And that, again, doesn't mean that I have to speak for women. I have to speak about my complicity with the sexist structures. And to do that effectively, that requires me to know the literature of what's going on. You know, it's not something that I will automatically know because I'm that smart, because I'm not. I have to learn from women and their struggles in order to speak with any type of intelligence.
Thank you. I really appreciate these kind of sentiments. I want to also make our listeners aware that in addition to your many other roles and titles, which I've already talked about, that you're also a screenwriter and you wrote the screenplay for your 2017 documentary film, Trails of Hope and Terror. And for the film, you've made 5 trips to the border and you interviewed people about their own experiences of border crossing. And from these incredible firsthand accounts that you've heard and maybe even from your broader work, what strikes you about the role of gender in conversations about religion and immigration?
What I find so often, especially on the issues of immigration, is the specific traumas that immigrant women go through that also often is ignored or is glossed over. When I was making the documentary, we visited a women's shelter on the Mexican side of the border to hear their stories. What it did for me is it showed me how the power of storytelling, the autobiographical story of these women's abuse on the border, or why they even tried to cross in the first place, created a dimension for me that so often is ignored. It's so easy sometimes to look at immigration as a legal issue, as an economic issue, as a foreign policy issue, as a political issue. But the human issue specifically of a woman's body and how it's abused on the border is, I think, one of those stories, one of those themes that I think is so often ignored.
So when we think about the role of religion and gender at the border and what's happening in the scholarly community around that conversation and what's happening in the public and in the news and in churches and synagogues among everyday people?
I want to say that unfortunately not much is happening because, like I mentioned earlier, some of these stories, some of these issues aren't necessarily in the forefront. I also want to say that many of the leaders that I see working for immigrant rights are women. And I think that definitely creates an opportunity to explore some of these issues. But all too often, those issues don't seem to come up to the forefront. I know of the traumas of women only because I've been at the border and I've walked the trails and I've talked to women and heard their stories. For example, the fact that many women go on birth control months before they cross the border because they are preparing for the point of probably getting raped and then not being impregnated. That part of the story I don't see highlighted.
And it's hard to know how to respond appropriately to that kind of important sentiment. And I may give it a try. Are you saying that it's not where we go, that kind of trauma, that kind of bodily trauma that's incredibly gendered? is not where we go in either scholarly or public conversations.
I would say that, yes.
And what can religious communities, I know some of our listeners are religious leaders who are listening right now. Some of them are women who are religious leaders. What can our religious communities, our faith communities really be doing right now to bring more justice at the border?
I would say there's several things that could be done. At the very least, come to the border. Don't take my word as to what's going on. Don't listen to the newspapers and the radio stations. Come and see for yourself. The only reason I can speak with authority about the border is not because I read it in a book. It's because I actually have spent time with leaders at the border who have taken the time to teach me what's going on at the border. So I would say, at the very least, a church leader should plan to take a group of their parishioners down to the border. Number one, that would revolutionize the church. You can't go to the border and come back and not be transformed in a very real way. Number two, it would revolutionize the faith. When you actually begin to see what the biblical texts have been talking about all along when it says, I was an alien among you and you took me in. And if your church cannot be a sanctuary church, then work with a church that is and providing the resources for that church to continue being a sanctuary church. I mean, our churches, if the church is not radically engaged in the gospel message of liberation, then it might as well just become a museum. It does no purpose or no service to humanity whatsoever unless it's being part of the transformation of humanity.
Thank you. That's well put. I'm interested, too, to know what you think about crossing political borders, if it's even possible. In these times, is there hope for crossing political borders when it comes to issues of justice and gender and migration at the border?
Let me answer it this way. Before I became a scholar, I was a right-wing fascist Republican who ran for the Florida House of Representatives as the most conservative person on the ticket. So I think the very message of gospel is that anyone can be transformed to become more just. So I was that person on the opposite side of the political divide. And it was only because people were willing to share with me their stories of suffering that I slowly began to change my political and religious views and became the type of person I am today. I think all of us have the capacity to radically change. And I think we need to be careful. At times, I think we need to be careful not to always turn people off. We need to speak boldly when it needs to be spoken, but at the same time, we need to show some grace for those who are willing to learn.
I really appreciate you saying that. That's not the kind of sentiment we're hearing much lately. Let me ask you this along the lines of searching. What is a teacher, as a professor, what's something you want students to know in these times? What's something you want them to know in particular about issues of gender and religion at the border?
I want students to know how hopeless this struggle is, and that, quite frankly, the battle may not be won. As exciting as this moment is, as people are literally demanding in the streets for justice and for rights, I am also keenly aware of the white lash that more than likely will follow, pushing a lot of the advances that we may make even back. Trump as a white lash to a black man as a president is an example of what I'm speaking about. But what I want the students to realize is even if this moment may end up being hopeless, and we don't know what the future is, it could be we could move towards a more just society. We may not. what I want my students to really wrestle with is that, are you actively engaged in changing society because you think you're going to win? Or are you doing it because you have no other choice, because this is what defines your very humanity? It does not matter if I win or lose, because chances are I'll probably lose. What matters is being faithful to my humanity and to my faith. What matters is showing up and doing what has to be done to move the conversation forward. And then for those students of mine who are more religious and are doing this so they could get their ruby when they get to heaven, or diamonds on their crowns, I would argue, or I would try to have them to realize, if there is no heaven, will you continue doing what you're doing? Because, again, it defines who you are as a human. In other words, do we do this because we're going to get a reward? Or will we do this because this is what humanity has been called to do, to do justice and walk humbly before God?
Of course, you are someone whose work really is at the border, and I'm going to say many borders that are physical borders and more figurative borders. And one kind of question is, how can we cross borders? And then another is, and what will we do to tear them down when they need to be torn down?
That's a very good question, because all too often we think of the border as that physical line in the southwestern part of the United States. But in reality, borders are everywhere. And they're also very prevalent within the academy, in where these borders separate the voices of those from marginalized communities of color from the dominant white voice, which represents the epitome of scholarship within the academy. So one of the things that we all must become, I think, are border crossers, not just those of us who have been marginalized and these academic borders have kept our voices out. But my white colleagues need to also become border crossers and cross into our reality by not only reading our works, but also sharing those works with their students and with their other colleagues, and being transformed by what's going on the underside of their history.
I want to follow up on that a little bit. That was an excellent comment, that white scholars need to be border crossers as well. So becoming informed, learning. And let's talk about practices. I'm thinking, what are some of the practices that white scholars, white allies, if I may be so bold, can start to embody and put in place in this moment?
I would say that probably one of the major things that white scholars can do, especially white allies, which many times tend to be more liberal and progressive, is to come to the recognition that many times they themselves are the problem. I am reminded that when Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that letter from the Birmingham jail, he wrote it to the white liberal allies, trying to explain to them why we can't wait. So I think one of the major things that true allies really need to do, besides standing in solidarity with us, is not trying to slow us down or provide reasoning as to why we can't move forward at a quicker rate, in the same way that King did with his white allies at his time.
What is you've worked with multiple types of people, I know, from having had the privilege of looking at your work. And why would so-called progressive white colleagues want to slow others down? What are maybe some of the institutional fears that they might have? Does that question make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I'll answer it two ways. I'll answer it directly, and then I'll give you an example. So I think it's the fear of being outed as a racist, that somehow they might say something wrong that shows their biases. But the fact is, all whites are racist in the same way all males are sexist. In other words, no matter how much of a feminist I think I am, the male body that I inhabit makes me, at best, a recovering sexist, which means that at any time I could easily fall off the ragged, per se, and let my privilege work for me. I don't have to be a sexist in this culture. The culture is sexist for me. In the same way, white people don't have to be racist. The cultures are racist for them. So I think one of the fears is this idea that somehow they will say something wrong. But what I find is that that's okay because I say stupid things as a recovering sexist, which helps me learn how to be a better ally. I think that's part of the growth. So to answer your question, the best thing white allies can do is truly to speak about how they are complicit with their own structures of racist and systematic racism.
I want to turn now to where people can go forward. If our listeners have been as touched by this conversation with you as I have, what else should they be reading, or where do you recommend they turn now to learn more about immigration, religion, and gender?
Well, I have to begin with my mentor when I was doing my PhD program, and that's Katie Cannon. Because more than anyone else at the time, she really held my feet to the fire on my maleness. So I have to begin by giving respect to the ancestors who really began the raising of my own consciousness. Many of her students, Stacey Floyd Thomas, for example, and some who were not her students, like Cheryl Cook-Dugan, obviously Emily Towns. These are some of the women who really has shaped my own thinking. Within the Latinx community, specifically dealing with border issues, I'm thinking of Ana Maria Pineda as one example, and her imagery of the holiday in the Latino community of going house to La Posada. She talks about La Posada and ties it into the immigrant community of finding shelter going house to house. She has been very, very helpful in those imagery. Biblically, I'm thinking of Jackie Hidalgo, who her own work on reading the biblical texts has been instrumental for me. Praxis-wise, the current pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Allison Henderson, definitely is doing the work of sanctuary movement. I've had the pleasure of preaching at a church a few times. I've had the pleasure of interviewing her for one of the books I wrote and for other things. And she really has the feet on the ground perspective as to what actually is happening right now. So she's one of those go-to persons in my Rolodex, which is a term which I think I just age myself.
Thank you for the work that you're doing, just for who you are. I'm really honored that you took the time to be part of this when there are so many other things.
Oh, this is my pleasure to do this. I mean, I can't think of anything else I would rather do than to lift up the issues that are going on the border right now.
That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. Follow us on Twitter at RiceRPLP. Thanks to our guest, Miguel De La Torre. Today's show was written by Pamela Prickett, Rachel Schneider, and Haley Hemstreet. Our producers are 3 Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Elaine Howard Eklund. Until next time.